All right, folks, we are back, and we are black here on WLTH 1370 AM. That's 92.7 in the FM dial. Yes, we are back. Hope you enjoyed the Escape, should I say? One of the best R&B groups of the 90s. Finally, folks, we live in perilous times. Very perilous times. Times so perilous and challenging that it's easy to slip into the mind state that things are the worst that they are ever been. And that changing our society is a burden that is so large that it is impossible for any of us to bear. It's in times like these that it's easy to forget that just as bad as things are, they have indeed been worse in the past. Much worse. Much worse in the past. And that our ancestors lived and persevered through conditions that even the most challenged of us today would find unbearable. Perhaps no one embodies this often pyrrhic struggle for progress more than one man, Homer Plessy, whose fight for equality exactly 130 years ago seemed very fruitless then, but paved the way for many future victories in a future that he didn't live to see. Welcome to This Week in Black History.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose and the shape of your lips? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet?
I am black, beautiful, proud. I must be respected. I must be protected.
Yes, This Week in Black History, exactly 130 years ago, the Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, was a landmark ruling that basically legalized racial segregation. It basically legalized Jim Crow, something that would dominate the southern United States and much of the country, and the rest of the country wasn't doing so great either, for the next 70 years under the doctrine of separate but equal. So how did it get that way? Well, let's rewind. In 1892, a black man named Homer Plessy deliberately sat in a whites-only railroad car in New Orleans to challenge a Louisiana segregation law. He was arrested, and the case eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1896, exactly 130 years ago, the court ruled 7-1 that racial segregation was constitutional as long as supposedly equal facilities were provided for both races. Justice Henry Billings Brown wrote the majority opinion. Justice John Marshall Harlan issued a famous dissent arguing that the Constitution is colorblind and warning the decision would become as harmful as Dred Scott versus Sanford. We also talked about that case a few months ago. Now, here's how it affected America. For the next over 60 years, it legalized Jim Crow segregation. States across the South and even parts of the North, mind you, because here in the city of Gary, we were plenty segregated from what I've heard. I know a lot of black people who say that they weren't allowed to be in Miller, weren't allowed to go to the beach in Miller, weren't allowed to deliver mail. I knew a mailman when I was a kid growing up who used to tell a story about how he just was delivering the mail out in Miller, and a white man came out of his house and tackled him wearing nothing but a bathrobe because he didn't want a nigger delivering the mail. That was right here in Gary, Indiana. And his wife came out to help him stomp a mud hole in the mailman. Just goes to show you where we were not that long ago. This is a man I knew, who I was around the whole time I was a kid growing up, here in Gary. So it wasn't just the South. States across the South and parts of the American North even used this ruling to justify segregation laws known as Jim Crow laws. These laws separated black Americans in schools, trains, buses, restaurants, hospitals, parks, housing, bathrooms, and drinking fountains. And especially, probably most importantly, in voting access. It's funny, whenever you see somebody like Barack Obama or Kamala Harris or Tim Scott or whoever, they always say such and such is the first black senator post-Reconstruction. Or such and such is the first black representative of this post-Reconstruction. The reason they said that is because that during Reconstruction, there were over 2,000 black elected politicians all across the South. Black people were the most successful minority group this country's ever had in a very brief time right after slavery ended. That's why I don't attribute our limited success economically and politically in this country to post-traumatic slave disorder, any of that other nonsense. It's just flat out racism. People who were literal slaves were in Congress within 10 years of being freed from slavery. Our ancestors accomplished a lot 5-10 years after being enslaved. But things like this, separate but equal, Plessy v. Ferguson, legalized the idea that black Americans and white Americans should be separated. Now the issue is, and I got into an argument and a fight with somebody on Twitter not too long ago about this. There's become a whole cottage industry of people out there, because it was a rapper, David Banner, who talked about how Martin Luther King didn't love his own people. And Martin Luther King didn't love himself, and that's why he was fighting against segregation. No, fool. No. Segregation literally forced black people to pay taxes for entities that we had no ability to use. It's literally the epitome of taxation without representation. Black people were paying taxes and not able to use government facilities, not able to be represented in Congress, not able to be mayors, not able to be governors, not able to be senators. The voting access. This is why we had to have a Voting Rights Act. So no, we were not better off during segregation. This was catastrophic. We went from having thousands of black politicians in the South and a thriving black community in the South right after slavery to 90% poverty in 1940. We had 90% poverty. It is only once the New Deal programs, things like the FEPC, the Fair Employment Protection Commission, and other New Deal jobs programs and labor programs started to dig black people out of that hole under FDR. And then you saw in the 60s, LBJ and the Great Society programs, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, we were able to claw our way back to 30% poverty by 1970. Separate but equal was not equal. It was not. Well, black people had our own businesses. We had nothing. We were 90% poor and locked out of all political representation. That is what this ruling basically did to us. Black schools and hospitals were almost always underfunded and inferior compared to white facilities because they had nothing. Black people had no money, and we had no way of getting any money because we were locked out of everything. The ruling gave legal backing to a broader system of white supremacy during the late 1800s and early 1900s. You saw widespread voter suppression, racial terror lynchings, discrimination in jobs and housing, and exclusion of black Americans from all political power. We had no political power. We didn't have everything during segregation. You fools. The NAACP formed to fight these systems. And so the institution of segregation became a central issue, obviously for activists including Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Thurgood Marshall, and others. These efforts eventually challenged segregation in courts, protests, and legal legislation. In 1954, the Supreme Court would overturn the separate but equal doctrine in public education through Brown versus the Board of Education. This court would rule that segregated schools were inherently unequal, which became a major turning point in the civil rights movement. Even after Brown, segregation and discrimination has continued in many forms, including what we talked about earlier, the prison industrial complex and the legal system. But Homer Plessy, his legal foundation for state-mandated racial segregation was effectively dismantled. So rest in peace, and you know, big shout out to the big homie Homer Plessy, who started the fight. You can really start, I guess you could look at the civil rights fight as starting right there 130 years ago this week with the decision of Plessy v. Ferguson. Again, it's become so disheartening to watch so many people talk about the shortcomings of the Civil Rights Act as if there was not an entire system. Both parties, remember, we're fighting against both parties here. That's how Reconstruction ended. The Democrats and the Republicans got together and decided in the Compromise of 1877 that black people couldn't have any more political power. And that was it. And then you get Plessy v. Ferguson, and now, even to this day, with the war on drugs, you have Richard Nixon, you have Ronald Reagan, you have Bill Clinton, you have Joe Biden, who collaborate in destroying the lives of millions of black people in this legal system that is inherently racist, that Jesse Jackson, the late great Jesse Jackson, who just passed, told us in the 90s. He said, this crime bill is going to destroy black communities. Bernie Sanders said, you're going to destroy whole generations of people. They didn't listen, or maybe they did listen. Maybe that was the issue. Maybe they did listen, and they knew what they were doing. But the fight continues on. And it's important to know that, you know, people like Homer Plessy fought every step of the way. That's another talking point that annoys me to no end. This idea that our ancestors were passive and didn't do anything. That you didn't have people fighting every step of the way. That is why it is important to open the damn schools. Open the schools. Teach these kids something, because they say stupid things regularly about how our ancestors did not fight, or they were passive. They were not passive. They fought against systems that we could not even imagine, with consequences we could not even imagine. And no, their lives were not better than ours because segregation, we didn't have to work. No, bro, the Ku Klux Klan regularly used to run in black people's house, kill everybody inside. If you were lucky, they might just sexually assault all the women in the house, castrate all the men in the house, lynch you, set your house on fire, burn a cross in your lawn. That is not our reality in 2026. There's nobody from Homer Plessy's time of Jim Crow segregation who would not trade places with me right now in this fully furnished studio, surrounded by 6 computers, or you, or wherever you're at right now. People fought. People died. People sacrificed. And this is why we continue to fight now. All right, folks, it's time for me to get off of my soapbox. Just a pet peeve. I just had to do that segment after dealing with the idiots who keeps saying stuff. Oh yeah, before I get out of here, let me just say rest in peace. It just came down on the wires. Rob Bass, man. Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock. One of the great rap groups of the late 80s. One of the greatest hip hop songs ever. It Takes Two to Make a Thing Go Right. Just passed away at 59 years old from cancer. Damn you, cancer. Damn you. And hopefully the CIA will let us have the cure for it finally. And also, Kyle Busch, one of the great NASCAR drivers of all time, just died. He's one of the few NASCAR people I know. Rest in peace to both of those people. They don't let us play hip hop on the station anymore, so I can't do a tribute to Rob Bass, at least a proper one. But I just wanted to say rest in peace to Rob Bass, man. Really, an underrated MC's MC from the late 80s, and Kyle Busch.